Thanks for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, and check out my Instagram for cool science and not science stuff. And a big thank you to my patrons on Patreon for your contributions to my channel. Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoff. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. In this video, we're going to continue going through the details of the gait cycle, and we're going to look at the next two phases, and those are terminal stance and pre-swing. Now, before we get into terminal stance, let's do a very brief review of mid-stance. We talked about this as the third phase in the previous video. So let's start this video here of mid-stance. Now the question is, where does mid-stance actually begin? Technically, mid-stance begins when there's toe off on the contralateral leg. So remember, our reference leg that we've been talking about is this person's right leg, the one closest to us. But if you look, where this clip actually begins each time, it's on contralateral, or in this case, left toe off. And then mid-stance actually ends whenever the person's center of gravity is over the foot. And so that means that terminal stance begins with the center of gravity over the foot. And you can see here what terminal stance actually looks like. And we have four critical events of this phase. Initiation of the forefoot rocker, we'll look at that in a second. Controlled ankle dorsiflexion with heel rise. Trailing limb posture, and then free forward fall. We'll actually begin by talking about free forward fall. This refers to the fact that as the right lower extremity here goes more posteriorly as we go through terminal stance, it actually causes the right part of the body, especially, to start falling forward. Okay, now it's not like it's plummeting to the ground, it's a controlled fall, and it's not even that much, but this free forward fall actually induces two things. One, it helps to induce some knee flexion that we're actually going to see when we get into pre-swing, and then coupled with the heel rise that we're going to talk about in just a few minutes in terminal stance, it also helps induce plantar flexion, again, that we see in pre-swing. So that right part of the body is starting to fall forward a little bit, but it is controlled. Now the other things that we have, first of all, initiation of the forefoot rocker. Let's actually look at that. So remember when we talked about loading response, we had the heel rocker. This is actually where we had controlled plantar flexion, and it starts with initial contact here at the heel, and then we have this controlled movement of the foot down to the ground. And then that brings us into loading response, which is basically weight acceptance. And then we have the ankle rocker. This is something that we actually see from loading response through mid-stance. And this is where we have controlled tibial progression. So initially the tibia is kind of like this, and then it progresses anteriorly as it rocks over the ankle joint. And then in terminal stance, we start to see the forefoot rocker. The forefoot rocker really is continued through pre-swing, and actually what you see right here really is about the end of pre-swing. But what's happening in the forefoot rocker, notice, is that the heel's coming up off of the ground, and we're transferring weight and rocking onto the balls of the feet right here, which is really the forefoot. Okay? And so this is where weight is being transferred to. So heel comes up off the ground, and the weight is being transferred onto the forefoot, really the balls of the feet. Now through terminal stance here, as this right lower extremity moves posteriorly, first of all, you can see very subtly at the ankle joint that we're actually getting a little more dorsiflexion. This is a controlled dorsiflexion. We'll see in a couple minutes when we look at the table that the gastrocnemius and the soleus, really the triceps suri back here in the calf, they're actually contracting eccentrically to control that movement of the tibia forward. Okay? So this movement of the tibia forward is really just induced by the leg moving backwards, but the gastroc and soleus are going to control that movement. So it's controlled ankle dorsiflexion. Now, as the right lower extremity moves more and more back, we actually achieve maximum dorsiflexion. So maximum dorsiflexion is achieved in terminal stance. And right around the time we get that maximum dorsiflexion, you can see it at the tail end, that heel starts to come up off the ground. Now, when that heel comes up off the ground, this is where we're initiating that forefoot rocker. And we're beginning to transfer weight onto the balls of the feet, which is the forefoot. You can see that heel's coming up, and as that heel comes up off, the MTP joints at the forefoot, they're going to achieve about 30 degrees of extension. And then the last thing to mention here is what's called the trailing limb posture. Okay? So trailing limb posture really just refers to the fact that the lower extremity trails the body, right? It's posterior to the body. Now, in order to have an effective gait, you have to have a sufficient trailing limb posture, meaning that you have to have sufficient hip extension to allow this lower extremity to move backwards. Okay, if you have limited hip extension and can only get your hips to neutral, where basically your lower extremity is directly under your hips, well then your gait is not going to be effective. You're not going to get the knee flexion we see in the next phase or the ankle plantar flexion in the next phase. And so getting this right lower extremity back to about 20 degrees of hip extension, that is trailing limb posture. And in order to get that trailing limb posture, you do have to have sufficient hip extension range of motion. Now let's look at terminal stance in a little more detail. And just as a reminder, the torque here, this is the induced torque due to gravity. Right here in the second row, this is going to be the reactionary torque due to the muscles, and then it tells us how much range of motion we need for that at each joint. So in terminal stance at the hip joint, we have an induced extension torque. So gravity is tending to want to make the hips go into extension. That's actually a good thing because we want more hip extension in order to get that trailing limb posture. At the end of mid stance, we were at neutral, 0 degrees at the hip. Now we're at 20 degrees of hip extension, so gravity's working with us and for us. And because of that, we have to control that movement, right? And so we're going to have increased firing of the anterior fibers of the tensor fascial lata, or TFL. Okay? The anterior fibers function more as hip flexors, but they're contracting eccentrically. We're obviously not going into hip flexion, we're controlling this movement from 0 degrees to 20 degrees with hip extension. So these are contracting eccentrically. It's also worth noting that we have decreased firing of the posterior fibers of the tensor fascial lata. And so now we're at maximum hip extension. This is the most hip extension that we will use through the gait cycle. Now what's happening at the knee joint? We also have an extension torque at the knee. So gravity is tending to want to take the knee into extension. Now in terminal stance, we're still at 5 degrees of knee flexion, but we have an extension torque. Okay? So obviously if there's a gravitational extension torque, but we don't actually change the angle at the knee joint, then we have to have some kind of knee flexor that's completely counteracting that extension torque. And the knee flexor is actually the triceps suri, in particular the gastrocnemius, because the soleus is a one-joint muscle and doesn't act at the knee. So it's really just gastroc here. Now remember, gastrocnemius is mainly a plantar flexor, right? But it has a secondary function as a knee flexor. So the knee flexor action of triceps suri is completely opposing the gravitational extension torque, and that keeps us at 5 degrees of deflection. So we didn't change the angle of the knee joint at all here from mid stance through terminal stance. Now for the ankle joint. If we go back and look at mid stance, we had 5 degrees of dorsiflexion. So now in terminal stance, we have 10 degrees of dorsiflexion. This is the maximum dorsiflexion angle that we'll have. Not only that, this is where we have the maximum dorsiflexion gravitational torque. So again, gravity is tending to want to make the ankle go into dorsiflexion. If we look at this right here, notice that as this lower extremity moves back and the tibia moves anteriorly over the ankle joint, again, that's putting more dorsiflexion at the ankle joint, right? Now, this dorsiflexion is controlled. Okay, we don't just want the tibia flopping over anteriorly, right? We want to control it. And so here is where the triceps suri actually peak in their activation. Okay, and so they're actually contracting eccentrically here to control that dorsiflexion. Again, this is controlled ankle dorsiflexion. Now for the subtalar joint, we're not going to go in a huge amount of detail here, but at the subtalar joint we have supination. Okay, I went over this briefly in the previous video on gait. In the other phases we actually had pronation, so let's actually go back. We actually had pronation in loading response, a little bit less pronation in mid-stance. And pronation is really good for shock absorption. And when the subtalar joint is pronated, the subtalar joint itself and also the tarsal bones, they're actually looser. They're a little bit further apart, and so they're more mobile. And so they're better at shock absorption, which is more important here because we're in weight acceptance, in particular in loading response. Also notice that in terms of eversion or inversion, the subtalar joint is also 5 degrees everted in both loading response and mid-stance. But when we go to terminal stance, Now we're only in 2 degrees of eversion. So technically, there's an inversion torque that's causing that, right? If we went from 5 degrees of eversion to 2, that's actually less eversion, so we can think of it as being caused by inversion. And so there's actually an inversion torque at the subtalar joint that's decreasing the amount of eversion to 2 degrees. Okay? Now back to this. Overall, the subtalar joint is supinated in terminal stance. Okay? This is going to be important for force production that's going to allow us to push off through pre-swing in the gait cycle. So when the subtalar joint is supinated, those tarsal bones are more closely packed together. They're tight. And this allows them to act as a rigid lever, so that way we can use muscles to push off and generate some power. So pronated is better for weight acceptance and shock absorption. Supinated is better for pushing off, acting as a rigid lever for muscles. And so that's important to understand. Also note here that tibialis posterior, or posterior tib, is contracted concentrically. This is the major muscle of subtalar supination. So when you think of supination, think of tibialis posterior. Also the soleus is contracted concentrically as well. And then the peroneals, or fibularis longus, fibularis brevis, these are contracted isometrically here through terminal stance. Right? Now this is the first phase where we see activity at the MTP joints, metatarsophalangeal joints. Okay? There's a gravitational extension torque. So as the right lower extremity moves back and that heel comes off, notice that we get extension at those MTP joints as we shift weight onto the balls of the feet, which is where the MTP joints are under the foot. Okay? So at the end of terminal stance, we should be not only have the heel coming off the ground, but the MTP joints need to be at 30 degrees. So this is actually where we start to see 30 degrees of extension at the MTP joints. And so this 30 degrees of MTP extension marks the end of terminal stance. You'll notice that the triceps suri and posterior tibialis are contracted concentrically here, and that's actually what's helping to produce that MTP extension. So if we look here, right as we're getting to the end of terminal stance and that heel's starting to come off, we're starting to generate some power as we're shifting weight onto the forefoot, onto the balls of the feet, right? So that's really the gastrocnemius and soleus pulling up the heel up. Right? That's their action, is to really start some plantar flexion, right? And we're going to continue that plantar flexion into pre-swing. However, as the heel comes up off the ground, that's what's causing a shift of weight onto the balls of the feet and producing that MTP extension. So even though the triceps suri and the posterior tibialis, which can assist in plantar flexion, even though they don't have any action directly at the MTP joint, by pulling the heel off of the ground, they indirectly allow weight to be transferred onto the balls of the feet, which produces that 30 degrees of extension. We also have to talk about the pelvis here in terms of rotation in the horizontal plane. We got 5 degrees of backward or posterior rotation and anterior tilt. So this is where we left off in mid stance, of course. And then here's terminal stance. Here's our contralateral limb, it's in front of the body, and then here's our reference limb, the right lower extremity, behind the body. In order to allow this to come behind the body, the right hemipelvis has to rotate backwards. So you see here that it's actually rotated a little bit posteriorly. It also tilts anteriorly. So when the pelvis tilts anteriorly, this is a movement in the sagittal plane. And what that does is it actually positions the acetabulum also a little bit more posteriorly. Okay, the top of the pelvis is tilting anteriorly, but the bottom of it is actually shifting more posteriorly when the pelvis anteriorly tilts. And so both of those things actually position the pelvis in such a way that you can get easily that 20 degrees of hip extension to allow for that trailing limb posture. And then that leads us to pre-swing. Pre-swing is really straightforward. In pre-swing, it begins when we're at 30 degrees of MTP extension. You see that right here? The heel is off the ground already. We already saw that in terminal stance. But the big thing here is we have 30 degrees of MTP extension. As we go through pre-swing, it's going to end as soon as the toes come off of the ground. And it's cut a little bit short there. But the instantaneous moment that the toes come off the ground, that's when pre-swing ends. Okay? Now there's 2 major things that have to occur during pre-swing. We have to have adequate knee flexion, and we have to have adequate plantar flexion. So as we go through this, look how we're getting plantar flexion. The heel's coming further up off of the ground. weight is being transferred more and more onto the balls of the feet, and eventually the toe will actually come off of the ground. And that moment when it comes off is called toe off. Also, if you look at the knee joint, you can see us going from about 5 degrees of knee flexion at the end of terminal stance to a significantly greater amount of knee flexion. So let's talk about pre-swing in a little more detail. Remember, in terminal stance, at the hip joint, we had a gravitational extension torque. That's our induced torque. Well, that induced torque is decreasing during pre-swing. So it's still extension, but it's less extension than we saw in terminal stance. Now what we see here is that we have a couple muscles that are contracting here, especially for the hip. We have the adductor longus contracting concentrically, and then also the rectus femoris. So rectus femoris we normally think of as a quadricep doing things like knee extension, but here it's actually functioning as a hip flexor. Okay, and so by functioning as a hip flexor in coordination with adductor longus, it's actually taking the hip into a little bit more of hip flexion. So we go from 20 degrees of hip extension in terminal stance to only 10 degrees of hip extension in pre-swing. That is net hip flexion. Okay, we're not in a flexed state because we haven't passed neutral yet. That'll come during swing. But we've done some hip flexion, and that's due to rectus femoris in conjunction with adductor longus. Okay. Now at the knee joint, now we have a flexion torque. And you'll notice here at the end of terminal stance, we'd have about 5 degrees of knee flexion. We go up to a whopping 40. Now, we're actually going to see in initial swing in the next video that we get up to 60 degrees of knee flexion. But we go from 5 to 40 degrees of knee flexion. That's a 35-degree increase. This knee flexion that occurs during pre-swing is what we call a passive knee flexion. Okay? When you think of knee flexion, like going to the gym, you do a knee curl, you're using your hamstrings, right? You're not using the hamstrings here. None of these are hamstring muscles, right? This is a passive knee flexion. The knee flexion is really induced by two things, one joint above and one joint below. So at the hip joint, we're getting some hip flexion, right? We went from 20 degrees of hip extension to only 10 degrees. So we went 10 degrees in the flexion direction. So that means the thigh is coming forward, right? Also, the heel's coming up off the ground more. We're going into more plantar flexion here at the ankle joint. And so that's going to allow the tibia to come anteriorly. So because the tibia is kind of moving forward and the thigh's moving forward, that actually induces the knee to bend. The knee actually undergoes passive knee flexion. So it does not require hamstring muscles. That's very important. So if you have somebody who doesn't get a lot of knee flexion during the pre-swing of the gait cycle or initial swing of the gait cycle, you don't need to strengthen hamstrings because hamstrings are not going to be used here in pre-swing. Okay? This is passive knee flexion, really induced by the hip flexion we see from terminal stance to pre-swing and also the ankle plantar flexion. That leads us to the ankle joint. So in terminal stance, we had a maximum dorsiflexion torque. That was our induced torque. In pre-swing, there's a little bit less dorsiflexion-induced torque. Okay, so not as much of a drive into ankle dorsiflexion. Also during terminal stance, that's where we see maximum activity of the triceps surae, so gastroc and the soleus. They're really inducing plantar flexion that's carrying through into pre-swing. So at the start of pre-swing, we still have a lot of triceps surae activity. It starts to decrease as we go through pre-swing, but at the start of pre-swing, the triceps surae are very active, and they're plantar flexors. And notice, in terminal stance, we went from 10 degrees of dorsiflexion all the way to 15 degrees of plantar flexion. That's a 25-degree difference, because we're 10 degrees on one side and 15 degrees on the other. So now we're in 15 degrees of plantar flexion here, and that's really induced by the action of the gastroc and the soleus. Now at the beginning, of course, of pre-swing, we have that triceps surae activity, but as we go through pre-swing, it starts to decline a little bit, and then we start to get increased activity of the pretibials, so like tibialis anterior. Again, they're really sort of controlling that movement, and so making sure that it's not excessive. We still want to generate a lot of power with the triceps surae, but those pretibials are going to start controlling that a little bit more toward the end of pre-swing, and that's also important because as we lift the leg off of the ground in initial swing, the next video, the pretibials are going to have to actually contract a lot in order to keep the toes from slapping on the ground, basically to clear the foot across the floor. So when we get into the swing phase, the pretibials are going to be pretty much maximally contracted. And so they're starting to contract here at the end of pre-swing. You could think of it here that they're just really controlling that plantar flexion a little bit towards the end, but they're really just preparing to activate in initial swing and mid-swing when they're the most important. And then for the MTP joint, we go to 60 degrees of MTP extension. Okay. Also notice that the induced torque at the MTP joints is still an extension torque, but it's a little bit less than what we see in terminal stance. Now, to get more MTP extension, first of all, we have the activity of the triceps suri. Remember, they're more active in terminal stance, right? But as we go into pre-swing, they're still active. Their activity is just decreasing, right, as we go through pre-swing. Eventually, in pre-swing, their activity stops. Okay, that's important. So the gastroc and soleus activity are going to stop. But while they're active and they're inducing more plantar flexion, that gives us an indirect added extension to 60 degrees at the MTP joint. So again, the triceps suri are not acting directly there. They're acting indirectly at the MTP joints. Okay? But during pre-swing, near the end of it actually, their activity stops. Okay? And then for the pelvis, it's still in 5 degrees of backward rotation because the lower extremity is still behind the body. So if the lower extremity is behind the body, then that half of the pelvis, so the right half in this case, is still going to have to be posteriorly rotated. Okay? So hopefully this video gave you a good understanding of the middle parts of the gait cycle. In the next video, we're going to continue on with initial swing, and that will take us to the end with terminal swing. So please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you.